Ever feel like those little details buried in a contract, the ones nobody actually reads, could come back to bite ya?
Mm.
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. A case about seafarer rights, a serious illness, and a legal battle that ended up all the way at the Philippines Supreme Court.
And this one really drives home just how crucial it is for seafarers to understand what's in their POEA contract.
Right, because we're not just talking about some small print. This is about someone's health, their ability to earn a living.
Absolutely.
So let's set the scene. We've got Celso Caraan, a motorman working for Grieg Philippines, and he starts experiencing some really troubling symptoms while he's out at sea.
Yeah, we're talking painful urination, blood in his urine, the kind of stuff that would make anyone panic, let alone when you're miles from land.
Okay, so that's got to be terrifying. What happens next?
So the ship docks in Japan, and Carrion's able to see a doctor. They diagnose him with a urinary tract infection and chronic prostatitis.
Serious stuff, but I'm guessing not the worst case scenario at that point.
You think so, right? He receives some initial treatment and is told he needs a follow-up. But things really take a turn when he's sent back to the Philippines. That's where this contract detail we mentioned rears its head, the 3-day rule.
Hold on, he's just been sent home, repatriated, I think is the official term.
Yep, that's it.
So he's sent home, he's feeling awful, and now there's this ticking clock to see a company doctor, or else he risks losing crucial financial support.
That's the situation. And that's the issue that ultimately lands in the lap of the Supreme Court. Is this 3-day rule a hard and fast rule? Or can there be some flexibility when life throws you a curveball, so to speak?
Because, let's face it, real life rarely goes as planned,
Exactly.
especially when you're dealing with health issues. So the court really dug into the reasoning behind this 3-day rule.
They did. They acknowledged that in many cases it serves a good purpose, helps companies track illnesses, prevents disputes over whether something happened because of work, and ensures seafarers are getting medical attention promptly.
Okay, that makes sense. But in Karen's case, it's not like he's choosing to skip out on a doctor's appointment. This is a serious medical condition, and it sounds like it's getting worse quickly.
Exactly. And that's where the Supreme Court looked beyond just the strict letter of the law and considered the spirit of the law. They had to decide, would sticking to a strict interpretation of this 3-day rule actually contradict what it was designed to do?
Which was to protect seafarers.
Exactly. And to add to that, they even looked back in previous cases, like the Wallum and Status cases, where they'd made exceptions because of the unique circumstances.
So there was precedent for bending the rules when the situation called for it.
Right.
What happened in Carrion's case? Was he able to get to that company doctor in 3 days?
Well, he lands in Manila, but he's in no condition to travel to the company's main office for that required medical exam. Remember those symptoms he was having?
Yeah, not getting any better.
He ends up hospitalized in his home province. And after a lot of tests, he receives a much more serious diagnosis: renal cell carcinoma,
Oh.
a type of kidney cancer. We're not talking about a simple infection anymore. This is life-threatening.
That's a game changer. And I'm assuming that 3-day clock is still ticking in the background.
Absolutely. Just to highlight the urgency, Carnian ends up having to have his left kidney surgically removed.
Wow. So this is a major, major health crisis. What did the Supreme Court do? Did they just completely disregard the 3-day rule because of how serious Carina's condition was?
Well, they didn't just throw out the rule completely, but they interpret it with nuance. They consider this idea of substantial compliance.
Substantial compliance. That sounds like legalese for he couldn't physically be there, but he did everything else right.
Yeah, you got it. And this is big for anyone listening, not even just in maritime law. This is about contracts and obligations in general. Sometimes the context matters.
It's not always black and white. So what did the court consider as substantial compliance in this case?
So first, his wife had been in constant contact with Grieg Philippines, keeping them in the loop about his condition and the fact that he wasn't able to travel to Manila.
Okay, so it wasn't like they were left in the dark. There was clear communication, even if it wasn't directly from Carrion himself. What else?
Right, and they already had the information about his initial health issues from when he was in Japan. And really important here, Carrion used his company-provided health card for the treatment in the Philippines.
Ah, so there would be a record of it.
Exactly. The court basically argued that Grieg Philippines had been informed and they had every opportunity to be following along with Carrion's condition.
So that kind of makes the whole he didn't physically report argument a little harder to make.
Right. The court essentially said, let's be real. The whole point of this rule is about prompt assessments and preventing these kinds of disputes. Delaying critical medical care to strictly follow this rule would defeat the purpose of having it in the first place.
So, a win for common sense. But this
Exactly.
wasn't just about one man and one rule, was it?
It really wasn't. This decision sends a powerful message, and not just in maritime law either. This applies to any situation where a contract is involved. Rules are important, sure, but they shouldn't be applied so rigidly that they lead to unfair outcomes.
Especially, like you said, when someone's health and their ability to earn a living are on the line.
Absolutely. The court really balanced those legal principles with practicality and compassion. And honestly, that's something everyone listening can take away from this. Sometimes blindly following the letter of the law, whether it's a work contract, a school policy, an agreement with a friend, it can lead to results that just aren't fair.
It's a good reminder to know when to stand up for yourself, when a rule maybe needs to be applied with a little flexibility because of your specific situation.
Yeah, and it reminds us that courts can make those judgment calls. They don't always just blindly enforce the rules. They try to consider the context, the bigger picture of what that rule is supposed to be doing.
Right. So this wasn't just a win for Careen then. This sets a precedent that could impact future cases for other seafarers.
Oh, definitely. By focusing on this idea of substantial compliance, the Supreme Court basically created a more flexible way to look at these kinds of claims. They're acknowledging that difficult situations are going to come up and demanding strict adherence to a rule, especially when someone's seriously ill. It's just not always reasonable or just.
A win for common sense and for seafarers' rights.
Exactly. In this case, it really highlights a few key takeaways for everyone, not just seafarers. First, know your rights. Whatever it is you're doing, whether you're an employee, a tenant, a consumer, whatever, if there's a contract involved, if your rights are laid out in writing, take the time to actually understand what it says.
Because knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. The more you understand your own rights, the better you'll be able to stand up for yourself if a situation arises where you think those rights aren't being respected.
Okay, so knowing your rights is key. What else can our listeners take away from all of this?
Documentation, documentation, documentation. The fact that Caraan's wife was keeping Grieg Philippines updated on his condition and that he used that company health card, those are vital pieces of evidence in this case.
Right, so even though he couldn't physically get to that company doctor, there was a trail that showed he was seeking treatment, that the company knew what was going on.
Exactly. And that's so important for anyone who might ever need to prove that they've taken certain steps, that they've met certain obligations. If it's not documented, it's really difficult to prove after the fact. So keep those records, take notes, put things in writing when you need to.
Yeah, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Good advice. So we've got know your rights, document everything. What's the third takeaway?
Don't be afraid to get legal help if you need it. Navigating the legal system, it can be incredibly complex. Having an expert in your corner can make all the difference.
Especially in a situation like this, we're talking about Carmson's health, his ability to work, his financial security. That's huge.
Absolutely. While you're not going to need a lawyer for every situation, it's always a good idea to at least consult with one if you're ever unsure about your rights or how to handle something.
Think of it as an investment in peace of mind, even if it feels like another hurdle at the time.
I like that, an investment in peace of mind. Because in legal matters, just like in life, a little prevention can be worth a whole lot of cure.
Words to live by. You know, it's easy to get caught up in the legal back and forth of a case like this, but at its core, this is a story about a man who got really sick, and he was just trying to get the support that he was entitled to.
That's right. And it highlights how important these disability benefits are for seafarers who are often facing risky working conditions. They're far from home when emergencies happen.
They can't exactly swing by the local clinic when they're out at sea.
Exactly. They rely on these systems to be fair, to be just, especially when they need them most.
Right.
This case really reinforces that these rules are in place to protect seafarers, not to create roadblocks for them, especially when they're already dealing with a health crisis.
It's about finding that balance we talked about, upholding what the rule is supposed to do, but also making sure it's applied fairly, regardless of the situation.
Right, and it's a good reminder that the law is constantly evolving. Cases like this one, they force the courts to clarify the rules, to interpret them in new situations, and sometimes, to set new precedents that have a ripple effect on how similar cases are handled moving forward.
It's really interesting to see how these real-life situations can have such a lasting impact on the legal landscape.
Exactly. And it's why it's so important to stay informed, to ask those questions, and to engage in conversations about these issues, even if they seem really complicated at first glance.
Because these aren't just abstract legal debates, these are things that have a real impact on real people's lives.
Absolutely.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of maritime law, workers' rights, and the importance of striking that balance between legal principles and just outcomes.
It has been.
But before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listeners with a little something to think about. Remember how Carraan's diagnosis, that kidney cancer, it was so serious, and how that played a role in the court's decision? What if his condition hadn't been as severe? What if it had been something easily treatable? Would the court have ruled the same way? It's a question worth thinking about, maybe even discussing with others. It really makes you think, does the severity of a situation, does that change how strictly we apply the rules? Should it?
It's a big question, and it goes way beyond maritime law when you think about it.
Right.
It really does make you wonder if things would have played out differently, if Caraan had been dealing with a less serious health issue.
Would the court have been as understanding about missing that 3-day deadline? Would they have been more focused on the letter of the law, instead of the spirit of it? It's really interesting to think about.
It really highlights how crucial it is for seafarers, especially those working under the POEA contract, to be aware of this precedent, knowing that this idea of substantial compliance is something that they can argue could make all the difference.
This case really drives home the point that even though these contracts are standardized, how they're applied, it's not always so clear-cut.
Well said.
I think that's a great point to wrap up on.
Yeah.
It's been a really eye-opening look into the world of maritime law, workers' rights, and that constant push and pull between sticking to the rules and making sure things are fair. So to everyone listening, remember, knowledge is power. Understanding your rights and advocating for yourself, those things can make all the difference, especially in situations like this where the stakes are so high.
Absolutely. And never underestimate the power of good documentation.
So true. A paper trail can be your best friend. Well, to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into a topic that honestly doesn't get enough attention. Until next time, stay curious.